Good afternoon and welcome to our second series of live webinars. During this second series, we continue to explore some of the challenges faced by the investment industry. We will inspire you how behavioral tech helps in digitally converting your die-hard savers into investors, retaining them and rejuvenating your client base. I'm Laurent Lamblin and will be your host today. Of course, today I'm pleased to welcome Gosia as our speaker today. Good afternoon, Gosia. I don't know if you're hearing me. Gosia has 18 years of experience in various functions within the financial services industry and innovation teams. She is an expert at integrating behavioral technology and digital banking tools to turn clients into investors. Gosia contributed to the digital transformation of investment processes within KBC Group, leveraging on her behavioral finance expertise, in-depth knowledge of MiFID II, and her passion for service design thinking. Today, she will focus on the upcoming EU European Sustainability Regulation and some of the challenges as the deadline is inching closer day by day. The biggest challenge of ESG and MiFID is not to discourage clients from getting through this new questioning and technical jargon. Indeed, there is no point in scaring clients and prospects with overly complicated processes. I'm sure Gosia will inspire you on how a clever approach can help realize high conversion rates. People need to understand or relate to the products offered. After all, the last thing we want to happen is to disappoint clients after they have bought their investment products. After Gosia's session, we will, of course, take some time for questions. Please don't hesitate to post your questions in the chat somewhere below in your Zoom session, or share your thoughts in the same chat. So let me invite Gosia to take over my screen, and I'll be seeing you after her presentation. Gosia, the screen is all yours.
Thank you, Laurent, for this great introduction. I hope you're now all seeing my screen. Good afternoon, everyone. Today, I'll try to inspire you how to seize ESG as a commercial opportunity. I'll show you how to future-proof your MiFID profiling without losing potential customers in the process. But first, let's start with a brief recap on what this new piece of legislation is all about, so that we're all on the same page regarding what is the minimum that has to be done regarding capturing these ESG preferences. 3 months before the deadline, and there's still much uncertainty regarding the latest MiFID amendment, and this makes August 2nd a hard deadline. Yes, the level 1 is published, obviously, but the guidance usually found in level 2 and level 3 texts of legislation is not yet available. And what is known is not final and is subject to change, with an expected delivery date after the August deadline. All this makes there's a lot of interpretation ongoing, and any solution you develop in-house will probably be subject to change. What's more, it's probably not the last time MiFID legislation will change. And in the meantime, we face these new requirements that are both complex and complicated. And this complex matter has an impact on all building blocks of the investment space and all components of the customer journey of an investor. For preferences, we have to capture customers' view on sustainability and explain his choices and their consequences. For advice, we have to match products with clients' wishes and transition to an ESG-aligned portfolio. Well, it's a lot to process, but today's webinar, I'll focus on client preferences. So, client preferences in MiFID. First of all, why change MiFID? I often wondered, and maybe you all did. So why change MiFID? We all heard about the European Green Deal objectives. The European Union wants to transform our economy into a more sustainable one. And one of the key drivers is to put sustainability at the heart of the financial system. And the strategy to realize this was put in an action plan of sustainable finance, where one of the reforms is incorporating sustainability when providing investment advice. But in order to do that, some issues needed to be tackled first. Indeed, first of all, most clients don't mention sustainability themselves, and most questionnaires didn't give them the opportunity to do so. Secondly, there are many different ESG ratings and product labels. They're confusing investors and making a comparison between products virtually impossible. And last but not least, greenwashing. And we all know some very good examples ranging from carbon neutral petrol to biodiverse friendly plastic. So there's an urgent need for uniformization and new requirements. And here enters MiFID. So in general, MiFID regulates investment services and activities, or in our context, investment advice. And the MiFID amendment itself relates explicitly to clients' sustainability preferences. From August 2nd on, the client can indicate that he has no specific preferences or that he has an A, B, or C type of preference. And let me immediately explain what it means. Type A preference is linked to taxonomy regulation. Taxonomy is a classification system for economic activities of financial and non-financial companies. And its purpose is to create a common language and criteria to determine if an economic activity qualifies as environmentally sustainable and to prevent greenwashing. Types B and C preferences are linked to a different regulation, an SFDR regulation. SFDR relates not to activities, but to financial products, and it regulates disclosures to end investors, so that the end investors will be able to assess how sustainable their financial products truly are. This slide shows you the link between the three principal regulations in financial advice regarding sustainability. So let's take a deeper look at the different preference types, one regulation at a time, but keep in mind this overview. So taxonomy. As said before, taxonomy is a classification system of economic activities, and an activity can only be sustainable if it contributes significantly to one or more of the 6 defined goals of taxonomy regulation. Currently, all of the goals are linked to the environment. And I say currently because we already know that, well, now there's only a taxonomy regarding environmental sustainability. There are rules in the making regarding social taxonomy. It's another sign that the ESG legislation in Europe is not final yet, and you'll need to prepare for fine-tuning and tweaking in the coming years. An activity contributing to one of those 6 goals is not automatically environmentally sustainable. This means that the activity is not automatically eligible as MiFID II aligned type A preference. There are 4 criteria an economic activity has to meet before we can call it taxonomy aligned, and before an investment in a company can be aligned with clients' type A preferences as defined by MiFID. First one is eligibility. So far, the screening criteria were provided for only 2 out of 6 objectives. And the screening criteria for the remaining 4 objectives are only expected early next year. This means that at present, only activities contributing to climate change can be taxonomy aligned. So that's probably the number 1 reason why it's so difficult to find financial products that are sufficiently taxonomy aligned. And it becomes very relevant when asking the client about his sustainability preferences. If the client sets their target too high, we might not be able to offer them even one suitable product. The second criterion is contribution, substantial contribution to one or more of the 6 taxonomy goals. And a third criterion is that if an activity contributes to a goal, it cannot significantly harm any other goal. Imagine you find a new energy source that emits zero carbon, but that kills all the fish in the sea. This would definitely be a no-go. Of course, the contribution to an objective and the do not harm principle are measured based on the technical screening criteria. Hence, rule number 1. And the fourth criterion, it's a set of minimum guidelines regarding social and governance aspects. And it's only when the activity complies with all 4 criteria that it is considered taxonomy aligned. So indeed, there is a clear difference between an eligible activity and an aligned one. Before an activity can be considered aligned, it has to comply with the 4 different criteria. And you immediately feel that there is a strong selection process and that currently there are only few activities that are eligible for type A MiFID preference. But it goes further than this. Being taxonomy aligned is very different from being aligned with the investor's preferences. It's the investor that determines the minimum alignment proportion with taxonomy, meaning how many activities in his financial product have to be taxonomy aligned. And this will prove very relevant when designing your sustainability client journey. Okay, let's move on to the second preference type. The second MiFID preference type, type B, is where SFDR comes into play. Remember, SFDR is a regulation that relates to products, financial products, and not economic activities. MiFID refers to a specific article of SFDR defining what a sustainable investment is, and the definition actually has similar building blocks as taxonomy. But in SFDR, the social aspect is already included. And also here, being SFDR eligible will not be the same as being SFDR aligned. Again, there are 4 criteria an investment has to meet before it can be called aligned. First, it has to contribute to an environmental and social social goal. The second is that the contribution can be measured by indicators. For example, how many windmills are built in a windmill park. And again, we have a do not harm other goals principle. And the fourth is a good governance practice. Here, a difference with taxonomy becomes immediately apparent. While in taxonomy, the goals and the screening criteria are defined in the regulation, in SFDR, it is not the case. Financial services providers have to define their own internal screening methodology. And there is a similarity as well. Same as with taxonomy, also here, additional level 2 guidance is not 100% final. And it's still subject to scrutiny by the European Parliament and the Council. So yet again, we are confronted with guidance that might be subject to change in the future, which means that anything you develop now might be subject to change in the future as well. After this SFDR screening, the financial products can be categorized based on how green they are, and the categorization goes from gray products, which don't promote sustainability, to very green, sustainable products. And it's only the last 2 product categories on the right that are eligible for a customer's MiFID Type B preference. The third preference type, Type C, these are instruments that consider principal adverse impacts on sustainability. And here also SFDR comes into play. PIEs can be actually seen as explicit examples of how you can measure the do not significantly harm principle. SFDR provides a minimum list of PIEs, but a financial services provider can always add additional PIEs, and it's up to the services provider to communicate how these PIEs are taken into account on the entity and product levels. This here is a short recap of the different PIEs categorized by team. Currently, it's still unclear how many PIEs have to be presented to the end user in a questionnaire, but we do know that this list is a minimum, and it's often referred to as Table 1. Okay, so you already received a lot of information, a lot of process. So let me briefly summarize how these three types differ. Remember, we have three preference types, A, B, and C. And the noticeable difference between type A and B preferences is that the first is about the environment, and the second is about the environmental and social goals. And pi is a different animal. Many financial institutions call type A preference environmentally aligned. And type B preference, they call sustainability aligned in a customer journey. And it's perfectly okay to do so, especially at this stage of the regulation. But we already know that taxonomy will also include a social aspect in the future. So consider future-proofing your customer journeys and use the similarities and the differences between the types as inspiration. And I know it can seem challenging, but always ready to help there. But first, let's take a look at what the MiFID II amendment requires us to ask from the customers. When you take a look at it, it looks very complex, and we have pages and pages of it. So let's simplify, as it all boils down to the following. The bottom line of MiFID amendment is that the customers can choose to add one or more of the three types of instruments to their portfolio. And of course, if you want to build your sustainability preferences customer journey, there's more to it. The client has to be able to make an informed decision. So first, you have to inform the client. You should explain all of the elements from the amended MiFID article, and of course, preferably in a way that doesn't scare away your typical customer. Next, the client can choose his preferences regarding the three instrument types, but he can also select his criteria, like minimum proportion of alignment and how the pies should be considered. And it's only once the client has determined how his sustainable investments should look like, he can choose how much of such investments should be present in his portfolio. And it's only then that you can give your advice. But what if no offer matches the potentially strict client preferences? Clients can adapt their preferences, but of course you have to record that change and the reason for it, and it's not a very happy flow. But it doesn't end there. On top of MiFID regulation, there is also the ESMA guidelines. And again, not finalized yet, but they already give an excellent impression of what will be required. So let's take a look. You remember investment objectives, risk appetite, investment horizon, that comes before the ESG questionnaire. There, ESMA states that self-assessment should be avoided. However, here, ESMA very explicitly states that gathering sustainability preferences is preferably done through a self-assessment. Next, ESMA allows for three simplifications. We can ask the client upfront whether he has specific sustainability preferences or not. If not, then the client is considered sustainability neutral, and a whole range of products can be offered in that case, whether they're green or gray, as long as they fit with his risk objectives. Next, we can make the customer journey more manageable by grouping pies into teams. And it is possible a customer first states in a live advisory context that he has specific preferences, but then he doesn't go further into detail. And in that case, ESMA says we are allowed to present a fallback option with the proposition the client will get instead. Also in the draft guidelines, there's mention of combination. The customer should be able to indicate whether he wants all of his preferences to be applied simultaneously or not. There is some contention regarding how this rule should be interpreted, and it's not clear yet whether it will remain in the final guidelines, since it goes beyond what's stated in MiFID II. But either way, try to tackle it in a smart way to avoid unhappy flows. All right, so now let's get a look at practice. We can help you design your sustainability objectives questionnaire and even the complete MiFID journey. But if you decide to do it yourself, let me give you a couple of pointers. When you start designing your sustainability objectives questionnaire, it's imperative to keep in mind a couple of things. The deadline is August 2nd. So you will need to have some sort of questionnaire ready by the next contact moment with your client after the August 2nd. For new clients, it will be profiling. For existing clients, it could be a profile expiration or the next periodic meeting, for example. The sustainability questionnaire should come after the investment objectives questionnaire, because risk preferences are primary preferences and may not be influenced by sustainability preferences. The sustainability preferences are applied on top of risk preferences. Also very important, you're not allowed to bias the clients. And when designing the journey, keep in mind ESMA guidance. For example, for the part where investment objectives are chosen, ESMA, remember, doesn't want us to use a self-assessment, but here, ESMA explicitly suggests that self-assessment is preferable for the sustainability preferences part. Okay, even though we expect much from the end customers, and we have many rules to consider, it is possible to limit the sustainability journey to 5 simple steps. Depending on your client's choices, the journey can be even shorter. We successfully created a journey of 2 to maximum 5 steps, depending on the client type. But even we are ready to switch the gears and adjust the journey. And you indeed should also be ready to switch gears. However beautiful your journey is and however many resources you put into it, the chances are high that it will have to change. The guidance to the regulation is not final. We expect ESMA only to give final advice after the deadline of August 2nd. So this might influence you here and there. Okay, but first things first, designing your sustainability customer journey. When asking for preferences, the first thing you have to do is inform the customer what it's all about, namely sustainability. And indeed, ESMA requires this so that the customer can make an informed choice. Here, ESMA guidelines are clear. All elements mentioned in the MiFID II amendment definition need to be explained in plain language. This doesn't sound very easy because the first image you have in mind is probably a very long screen with a considerable amount of information, and the client will just scroll through it without reading it, or even drop out of the profiling process. And there's nothing worse than losing a client because of a bad experience. It is, however, possible to smartly and engagingly structure the information. And there are, however, some attention points when doing that. First, you need to make sure that whatever you write appeals to all types of clients you cater to, meaning both the believers and the non-believers. So start with why sustainability to get them hooked. Don't forget to explain the choices, and above all, do not overdose. For example, use submenus, links, carousels, and so on to structure the information so as not to be overwhelming, because otherwise they won't read it anyway. And the last tip is to mention your strategy regarding sustainability. This way, you'll inform the clients upfront about all you already consider when advising products. The second step is the all-important choice the client has to make. Does he have an opinion on how a sustainable product should look like? Or does he rather trust the general bank's policy or his advisor? What's essential in this step is to make the choice and the corresponding consequences of it very clear. So please ensure the customer receives enough information up front regarding your exclusion policy, key points, and so on. This way, the correct target group will end up in the proper journey. And this is precisely the purpose of this screen, to redirect the client to the most appropriate journey. Maybe an important thing to note, when clients state that they don't have any specific preferences regarding sustainability, then, according to ESMA, they can be considered sustainability neutral, meaning that you can advise them any products. Okay, the preferences. The customer has indicated that he has a clear idea about how sustainability should look like. So in this case, in the third step, he's presented with eligible instrument types. Again, it's best to be very clear on the types, how they differ, and that the client can choose more than one instrument type. There are 3 instrument types, but you don't necessarily have to show the options in A, B, C order. Depending on your take, you can reverse the order and, for example, start with SFDR products or even the adverse impact products. It all depends on which storyline you want to focus on. I once heard a compliance officer stating that PI is for people who don't want to be bothered with technicality and the minimum proportions of taxonomy and SFDR. So you can leverage this idea and promote more easily explainable thematic PIs first. It all depends on your storytelling and getting the storyline right. The fourth step is all about the features. For the taxonomy aligned and SFDR aligned products, the customer can choose the minimum proportion of alignments. Here, the trick is to explain it properly so that the client won't confuse it with amount of sustainability in his portfolio. The percentage here is about the sustainable quality of the investment products, not about the quantity. Important to note is that the proportion requirement is to be fulfilled at the product level. This means making an average of a 0% plus 100% aligned product and then stating to the customer that he's 50% aligned. In total, it's insufficient. Another thing is that the indicator for the minimum proportion has to be granular enough. It has to be granular, but the use of ranges is allowed. And I already mentioned it, but it's a handy thing to know and very applicable in this step. ESMA leaves a way out for the customers who don't want to go into too much detail, especially in a life advisory context. Once the customer indicates he has specific preferences, he's not obliged to specify them. For example, he may have a good idea about which product types he allows in his investments, but it might be he doesn't have a preference for the minimum proportion. So if you want to give him this way out, it's up to you. But in case you do, you have to explain what the fallback scenario is for those customers which apparently, after all, don't have these very specific preferences. It might be hard to include this fallback option on your backend, but it's worthwhile to avoid unhappy customers. For investments falling under the principal adverse impact category, the customer can also choose features. Here, he can choose which elements demonstrate that his investments impact sustainability adversely. But of course, here again, an informed choice is required. So it should be clear which elements are linked to which PIs. And since there are several PIs, there are actually quite a lot of them, we are allowed to use teams to present those PIs and the elements, all to make it more manageable for the client. Teams speak, after all, more to the imagination than some technical elements. The last feature is that the client can choose how their preferences should be applied. According to current ESMA guidance, clients can choose whether all of their preferences must be applied simultaneously or whether compliance with one of their preferences is enough for positive advice. The most extensive interpretation of these guidelines is that customers will be able to choose which of the preferences exactly should be combined and which not. So, for example, a customer will be able to select that his PI and his taxonomy preferences have to apply simultaneously to his investments, But for example, complying with SFDR in and on itself is sufficient for them. Like I mentioned before, at this moment, it's still to be seen how broad this combination rule has to be interpreted. But since clarification is only expected after the implementation deadline, you might need to be able to switch gears quickly in the future. As for the last step, it only applies in the case of portfolio advice. The question doesn't have to be asked in the case of product advice. At this stage, the client has now determined which criteria his investments must meet. And now he may choose how much of those investments he wants in his portfolio. And after the customer has completed the sustainability questionnaire, it's time for advice and the suitability report. I mean, translating all of the client's preferences into a suitable product offer. But of course, it can be that it's impossible to meet clients' preferences initially, especially if he chooses a high alignment percentage or a very rigorous combination of his preferences. We know that 2 to 5 screens are enough to capture the sustainability preferences fully. But what's of utmost importance is avoiding the back to square one feedback loop. A customer, yes, he can redo the questionnaire, and in case of no offer, he even can deviate from his preferences on a transactional level, but it makes for a poor customer journey. And we cannot bias the client by warning him upfront about the lack of offer in case of some extreme preferences. But still, you must try to avoid the "sorry, unfortunately we can't service you" flow. It is possible to achieve this without biasing clients, but instead through behavioral finance and choice architecture. And the trick is actually simple. Clearly guide correct client types towards appropriate journey paths. And here are our last hot tips regarding the customer journey. You can take this new regulation as the umpteenth compliance must-do and treat it classically. For example, traditionally, superb services are designed and then very quickly, a MiFID sauce is thrown over it. That's actually the best formula to lose clients throughout the journey. Or you can make a virtue out of necessity and use ESG as an accelerator for your services. Doing so makes the customer better receptive to your advice. In our experience, we have actually seen the added value of thinking about clients-facing journeys and designing them using behavioral finance, instead of taking over blindly a regulation, letter by letter, while ignoring its spirit. Behavioral design of processes can lead to whopping results. We've seen conversion rates of 80% or 99% satisfaction rates, or even additional 10% net sales. And it's only by behavioral service design thinking that compliance becomes an amplifier to performance. We're always happy to guide you in this exercise. And we indeed expect a new exercise. Today, it's all hands on deck to reach the 2nd of August deadline, but it's not the end of the ESG regulatory roadmap. To reach the deadline, a lot of companies have taken shortcuts. For example, redirecting clients from the digital environment to branches or help desks, or bringing clients back to square one in the journey because of a lack of offer. This makes for suboptimal flows, both for clients and banks, and it will reflect in the sales numbers. So rework will be needed to revert to a more efficient way of working, to be more cost-effective and increase the cost-benefit ratios. But in a typical organization, it will take a lot of workshops and throughput time to reach this objective. So the solution here is to create focus through a dedicated team and apply agile methodology to gain speed. A typical project trajectory exists out of, for example, an ideation phase, where you create a design for your solution. You typically think on which journey you want to create. You gain regulatory approval and do some user testing to see whether your clients appreciate your solution. The second step in a typical project trajectory is a feasibility phase, where you prepare for development, by writing down requirements, checking ability to execute, and deciding on whether you want to buy a solution to gain speed or to build it yourself. And then the development phase, where the actual build, testing, and launch happen. Everyone Invested can help with each of these steps. For ideation, we inspire through webinars like this one, or newsletters, or blog posts, and movies on our websites. In the feasibility phase, we can help through tailor-made workshops, or we can do it for you with our API technology. A typical sprint approach would then be to do a pre-study, after which we'll scope, draft, assess, prototype, and validate a solution within a sprint. And if needed, we'll iterate the sprints. But to conclude today's session, let me summarize. In sum, what's needed to implement the latest ESG requirements is informing the customer about his choices and their consequences, collect preferences while avoiding back to the beginning loops where he has to adapt his preferences. And here you can use behavioral science to make the choices clear. You have to create a suitable advice flow and reporting, and to achieve this, it's best to determine an implementation roadmap. So that was it for today. Thank you all for your attention. And now we can take a couple of minutes for any questions you have.
Yes, thank you for that, Gosia. We have indeed some questions coming in. One of the participants just wanted to be sure that if this new EU legislation is applicable to all types of financial instruments, meaning do they also apply to individual bonds, individual stocks, and mutual funds?
Yes, this is definitely the case. So it applies to all these types of instruments.
And from the same person, actually, there was also a question concerning the deadline of August the 2nd. Is that something that is carved in stone? As you also mentioned during the presentation, the final guidelines have not been released yet. One expects them even after the deadline. So can we still expect that the regulator will postpone the deadline?
Actually, of course, the industry was hoping for that scenario, and they actually asked the regulator to postpone the deadline, but so far they received a negative answer. So it's very unlikely it will be postponed.
Okay. I also see with a lot of financial institutions that they actually, for the moment, have implemented at minima the regulation, meaning they just ask the question, do you have specific preferences? And if not, they go immediately to call centers, branches, physical work, etc., etc. Do you think that we will continue working like that, or that we will actually really kickstart the digitization of the ESG process without losing too much customers?
Well, it's of course up to the company strategy, but when I look at how our environment looks like, the new generations, the younger generations are so digitally savvy, and they expect an instant answer on their smartphone. So they expect a certain level of service. They are not motivated to go by day to a branch and have a discussion, or some of them might, but they want to have everything directly in their hand. So I think it's actually very useful to organize yourself, that you can accommodate to these types of clients as well. And of course, since they are expecting and they have very high expectation, they're all used to Amazon's and Google's type of experiences of today. So we have to also be able to provide that as a banking industry. And it's actually quite new in asset management and investing. It's not widespread yet that it's digital and that it's very efficient. So there is some work to do. And I think this ESG regulation is actually a huge opportunity to revise your processes and do it right from the start.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I don't see any other questions coming in. In that case, I conclude today's session. And I already invite you for our next session. During our next session on June 22nd, Jurgen van den Broeke will tackle a very hot topic in the investment space. That's how to keep the human touch in digital investment processes. During this session on artificial humanity, Jurgen will provide actionable insights on how to get everyone invested all the time. If you want to attend, please do not forget to register for this session. Visit our website at everyoneINVESTED.com/webinars, everyoneINVESTED.com/webinars. And for today, I can already state that recordings will be made available later to all attendees. And I would be grateful when leaving that you leave us some feedback on today's sessions. It helps us to improve for the future ones as well. Once again, thank you very much, Gosia, for your very clear expose and resume of that complex matter of ESG regulation. And thank you all for joining today's session. Looking forward to seeing you on June 22nd, and have a very nice day. Bye-bye.